Hello. In the traditional motion picture story, the villains are usually defeated. The ending is a happy one. I can make no such promise for the picture you're about to watch. The story isn't over.
I remember a nurse bringing my father down, and he'd gone from a man to this almost non-human creature. Here he starts to try to get rid of the equipment that they used to put him in sensory isolation. He's mumbling incoherently. He's trying to remove his goggles. He's trying to remove his cuffs over and over again, that he's incoherent.
We trust doctors. We put our lives in their hands, but some betray that trust. For the last 60 years, doctors working for the British and American governments have used psychological torture to destroy people.
They start off each interrogation saying, "Can I have your name?" I'm mentally trying to spell my own name. I don't know what the mistake is, but I know the way I'm spelling it is wrong.
To tell this story, we need to go back to the 1950s, when Scottish psychiatrist Dr. Ewen Cameron experimented on his own patients.
It is a period of tremendous change in psychiatry. With the enormous amount of world unrest, we are seeing the enormous demand for knowledge concerning the effects of stress.
The door's locked. This one's hanging. This one.
The MI5 agent, he simply identified himself as Andy. When they lifted the hood over my head, I see Andrew standing in front of me in the middle of the desert in Afghanistan. Andrew would simply say repeatedly, "There's nothing I or we, the British government, can do about your situation. You have to cooperate with the Americans."
They said, "What do you think about waterboarding?" I said, "I like it a lot, and I don't think it's tough enough."
Psychiatrists have a special responsibility to act as leaders and guides in entering and opening up this new territory.
And intense.
In the past, we have foolishly released hundreds and hundreds of dangerous terrorists, only to meet them again on the battlefield. I just signed an order to keep open the detention facilities in Guantanamo Bay.
A few moments ago, Dr. Ewen Cameron of Montreal, chairman of the organizing committee, opened this Third World Congress of Psychiatry with these words.
These are the days and hours are the occasions that summon up determination, fire of the imagination, and drive us forward in this greatest of endeavors.
About to go see the Allen Memorial Institute, where my father spent on and off 4 tragic years. I remember my dad before and I remember my dad after. It was 1 year after my bar mitzvah, so I was 14. And I remember the Christmas holidays that year with my father pacing the house, going back and forth, singing this sort of crazy song from, I think it's the 30s, called Maresy Dotes and Dozy Dotes and Little Lambs Eat Ivy, over and over and over again. And my being very puzzled and not understanding what was happening. which is how he ended up in 1956 going to see Ewen Cameron at the Allen Memorial Institute. Infamous stables. This building, for me, represents Cameron. So I'm face to face right now with my nemesis. I get this very strange feeling in the pit of my stomach. Inside were all these terrible things happening. And here I am in my 7th decade, and it's like it all happened yesterday.
By far, the most chilling experiments we have uncovered took place at this Gothic estate called Raven's Crag, halfway up Mount Royal in Montreal.
Then the drug began to take hold very rapidly. Things became very furry and very frightening. Nobody explained it to me. Nobody ever asked me if I was willing to do it or anything. I thought this was the coldest and most impersonal treatment that anybody could give to anybody in the world.
I haven't ever had to talk about this publicly. I don't like to reflect on what happened to her because it breaks my heart.
My mom and dad both worked, so I would go over to her house after school and we would hang out and watch TV and eat chips and drink Coca-Cola. But even as a young kid, I remember being like, that's my grandma, you watch out, you don't mess with her.
She did suffer from postpartum depression, which probably was misdiagnosed. So she was depressed a lot, she was suicidal. And my mother was very familiar with Montreal from having lived there, and so they chose the Allen.
By the 1950s, the Allen Memorial Institute was one of the world's leading psychiatric hospitals. Its director, Dr. Ewen Cameron, was the president of the American, Canadian, and World Psychiatric Associations.
My mother thought that Dr. Cameron was God. My mother thought Dr. Cameron was God.
Rudolf Hess was once called the conscience of the party.
He had been a psychiatrist at the trials at Nuremberg after the war, and she trusted him implicitly.
In 1945, the US intelligence agencies had asked Dr. Cameron to examine Hitler's former deputy, Rudolf Hess, at the Nuremberg war crimes trial.
Rudolf Hess, guilty of conspiracy and crimes against peace, life imprisonment.
Examining Nazi indoctrination at close quarters shaped the way Dr. Cameron thought about the vulnerability of the mind.
I'm trying to decide if that's a photograph of Cameron. You know, it's very interesting that his is the only photograph in which there is no name, and that he was the founder of this place. Isn't that odd? It goes to the 2nd, 3rd, 4th, etc. directors. How peculiar. Here's Cameron with his crew in this photograph. Somehow do no harm got forgotten. Pretty upsetting being in here, actually. And I can hold it together only so long, and then I kind of get overwhelmed by the feelings.
How old were you when she went in?
7. I was 7 when my mother went. I think whatever happened to her at the Allen never cured the depression and never cured the anxiety. Actually, it probably exacerbated it.
Where is Cameron's office? It's here.
Ewen Cameron was born in Bridge of Allan, Stirlingshire, in 1901. The son of a Presbyterian minister, Cameron soon outgrew Scotland. In 1942, he became an American citizen. Ambitious and driven, Cameron dreamed of winning the Nobel Prize for his work on the frontiers of psychiatry.
So we have just come into the original office of Ewen Cameron. On the wall there's an article from the Montreal Star about the donation of the mansion for the development of this program. As we look out the window, we can see the stables. The stables is where the sleep rooms were, where the psychic driving experiments took place.
We were very afraid of the sleep room. People in there were like babies. They cried and they were very disoriented. We used to walk very carefully against the side of the corridor that was opposite the sleep room with our backs to the wall when we'd go by.
Very strange. I think it's very easy for people to say that this is the story of one patient. To see this only and simply as a horrendous experience that happened in Montreal in the 1950s is to really miss the big picture.
There they are, citizens of Montreal, going about their business efficiently and politely. Appearances are misleading.
In 1951, Britain, America and Canada held a secret meeting in the Ritz-Carlton Hotel in Montreal. Among those attending were Henry T. Tizard of Britain's Ministry of Defence, Dr. Ormond Salant of the Canadian Defence Board, and scientist Donald Hebb. Two projects were discussed. The first was the SEER program.
There was some discussion of defensive techniques, of basically developing a method for training Allied aviators, personnel likely to be captured, fall in the hands of the Soviet bloc, so that they could be trained to resist torture.
Sometimes, in spite of everything a man can do, he falls into the hands of the enemy. If you were an airman whose plane was shot down in enemy territory, or a soldier, or a Marine captured in combat on the enemy lines, your first feeling might be one of helplessness, as if suddenly the whole world had dropped out from under you, leaving you at the enemy's mercy. Such a feeling is quite understandable, for a minute or two.
SEER stands for Survival, Evasion, Resistance and Escape. But there was a hidden agenda at the meeting.
The primary objective was offensive, in developing techniques that we could use against captured Soviets. So it was effectively a mobilization of psychology, in part in the United States, and that research was dominant within the Canadian universities for the better part of a decade.
The price of intelligence is a more complex brain, more easily disturbed, more vulnerable to emotional disturbance.
Dr. Hebb, who was just talking to us, paid healthy students good wages simply to rest on a bed like this, with nothing to see or hear or touch. They were strangely affected lying here. They had hallucinations. For those who endured a few days, the world seemed distorted afterwards, and for a while, simple tests were difficult to do. Small wonder that solitary confinement is used in so-called brainwashing.
Soon researchers began similar experiments in a psychiatric hospital in the UK. In the US, the CIA had over 160 secret projects in 80 institutions. $25 million was allocated to human experimentation. It was codenamed MK Ultra. Dr. Cameron's work at the Allen Memorial Institute was one of the largest projects in MK Ultra.
How did you feel when you learned that Dr. Cameron's experimentation was financed by the CIA?
Well, I thought, oh, I can't even use the word that I thought, because I thought, that bastard.
Along with the CIA, Dr. Cameron had another major funder.
How did you feel when you found out that the Canadian government was funding it?
Well, I mean, that's an even bigger betrayal, isn't it? To have the Canadian government involved in something that was really so incredibly cruel was worse than knowing that it's the CIA.
You are an angry person. You're angry at the doctors, you're angry at the nurses. Why are you so angry? Is it because you hate your mother?
Dr. Cameron began trialing path-breaking new techniques.
Why are you so angry? Is it because you hate your mother?
You are a hostile person.
And my father would be forced to listen to these voices. And they were high voices, low voices, spaced voices, faster, slower.
Is it because you hate your mother?
Where is my voice? When you look at the nurse's notes, my father is interacting with the voice and saying, "Where is my voice?"
I don't count anymore! I can't stand it!
And then very quickly my father is saying, "Stop this. I want this to stop. Why are you doing this to me?"
Now that you have children, you don't seem to be able to manage them and keep a good relationship with your husband.
Dr. Cameron had people listening to recordings. He saw an ad in the paper for how to learn a language while you sleep. And it was a recording of a voice speaking in Spanish that you would put in your pillow.
You are an angry person. You're angry at the doctors, you're angry at the nurses. Why are you so angry? Is it because you hate your mother?
One of the things that the tape said was, you are an angry person.
You're angry at the doctor, you're angry at the nurses. Why are you so angry? Is it because you hate your mother?
And she had to listen to this over and over and over again. I mean, as many hours in a day that she could.
What came back was a somnolent man who barely could talk, who couldn't really carry on a conversation, who lay down on a couch all day, mostly sleeping, who was a different person.
Naval transport bearing 407 Korean prisoners of war docks at San Francisco amid scenes of emotion.
In 1953, American troops began returning from the Korean War. Thousands were suspected of having been brainwashed.
I noticed on that inspection that the bombs, and I became certain that those bombs were germ bombs.
Communist fear gripped America.
It looks like an American town, as American as apple pie and ice cream. But appearances are deceptive. This is not an American town.
Americans, they have too many freedoms.
That is another thing you must remember, comrade. For one day it will be your mission to destroy those bourgeois capitalist freedoms.
We all know the atomic bomb is very dangerous. Since it may be used against us, we must get ready for it.
With terror came a huge opportunity for an ambitious psychiatrist. The American government were now spending $1 billion a year on psychological warfare. Hundreds of thousands of people were used as test subjects.
Brainwashing is so subtle, so devilish. There's a master mind behind all this mind manipulation.
Life for many is appallingly confusing. We have a very considerable obligation to undertake social engineering. It will take bold planning and brave hearts to develop this field.
The CIA used all kinds of exotic techniques. They were convinced that hypnosis could actually work. You could hypnotize somebody and wake them up and then send them off to do something that they ordinarily wouldn't do, and then you could snap your fingers and they forget all about it. Crazy stuff.
This 1962 film, The Manchurian Candidate, perfectly captures the paranoia of the time. It tells the story of a sleeper agent brainwashed by an enemy power.
Shoot Bobby Raymond through the forehead.
Yes, ma'am.
Many believed the mind control shown so graphically in this film was achievable by modern science. Our governments had to get there before the enemy did. Dr. Cameron first came to the attention of the CIA when he published a paper claiming he could wipe a person's memory.
Dr. Cameron had this amazing way of making up things. A contra trait he came up with, that if someone had the trait of being very passive, if you got rid of that trait, a contra trait would emerge where they would be more assertive.
Initially, Dr. Cameron believed this would help him cure mental illness.
Maybe at some level in Cameron's brain, it was to, find some way to cure schizophrenia, but he wasn't treating schizophrenics, certainly not in my father's case. And it was an experimental procedure. My parents never agreed to it.
Dr. Cameron didn't set out to develop interrogation methods, but his techniques proved useful to the CIA.
Yeah, I think this whole thing is all the journals, which was part of her treatment.
Yeah, I'm surprised. Part of me is surprised she was allowed to keep these. She says, well, today is the saddest day yet, since David left to return to Winnipeg. If I'm honest, I suppose I'm sad because I'm alone and wish I was not. But I'm sad also because of the break in David's life and Leslie's, and all the things that might have been. It seems such a waste somehow, all this dysfunction, disruption that has been going on in our lives.
I found a letter a correspondence between Papa and the doctor, and Papa was saying, we can't afford for her to be there much longer, and we might have to sell the house. And the doctor was like, we'll sell the house because she needs this. So that's why Papa sold the house.
It never really dawned on me that they essentially co-paid for the secret medical research.
Yeah.
In 1963, many of the psychological experiments were codified for the first time in the Kubark Counterintelligence Manual, a CIA guide on how to torture.
Kubark is a curious name. It's a cryptonym. It's the CIA's name for itself. And that was the foundation for the method of psychological interrogation, psychological torture that the CIA disseminated within the U.S. intelligence community and worldwide among allies for the next 30 years.
Within the decade, Britain would be using these techniques on her own citizens.
The terrorist campaign continues at an unacceptable level.
In the first 6 months of 1971, over 300 bombs ripped through Northern Ireland.
The ordinary law cannot deal comprehensively or quickly enough with such ruthless viciousness.
The British government's response was to introduce internment without trial.
After consultation with Her Majesty's government in the United Kingdom, I have therefore decided to
exercise where necessary the powers of detention and internment vested in me as Minister of Home Affairs.
On the 9th of August 1971, 342 people were arrested throughout Northern Ireland as suspected terrorists.
I was 23 years of age, and at 3:30 in the morning, waking up with an unmerciful pain in my stomach and sat upright in the bed, only to discover that I had been awakened by the butt of a British Army rifle thumping me in the stomach.
At 6 o'clock that morning, my mother came into the bedroom. She says, "You better get up, there's soldiers all around the house." So I got up and went down the stairs and opened the door. The next thing was that stuck a gun in my head and told me I was under arrest.
And possibly south of there. Wait out.
All of us were advised it might be a good idea not to be in your own home tonight. They seemed very keen to arrest me, and they were raiding houses that they knew I would have been frequenting. So I slept out in another home, and I was on the run for 2 months.
As everybody come in, would tell you what's happening outside. There's shooting and bombing and so many dead.
Reports were coming in from areas like Armagh, Lurgan and Newry and Derry, and the same picture was emerging of men being arrested.
Basically, it looked like war had erupted in Belfast.
British intelligence used Dr. Cameron's experiments in sensory overload and deprivation on their Irish prisoners.
Eyes! Front! Standard! Eight!
In 1971, there was a surge of bombings in the first half of the year in Northern Ireland. We believe that British intelligence, which had been privy to the development of these techniques since the early 1950s, trained the Royal Ulster Constabulary in these techniques. And then during the massive roundup of hundreds of people in mid-1971, they selected 14 prisoners for the kind of testing of these techniques in actual battlefield conditions.
We're taken outside and walking across grass, and I can hear the blades of a helicopter. I'm assisted into the helicopter, and the helicopter then takes off. The mind just going, what? This flight goes on 30 minutes or 40 minutes, but at that stage you were trying to think, what's going on, where am I going? There's nothing makes sense, just the only thing that makes sense is sheer panic and fear. And then the helicopter appears to slow down. These air compression doors fly open, and I'm lifted by the shoulders, passed along, and thrown out backwards.
The RUC coming in and putting a bag over your head, stripped and overalls put on us, spread eagled against the wall for hours on end.
There's a hood placed over my head. That's where panic set in, what the hell's going on?
It was exactly 2 months after internment. My wife and I were out for the evening and we were walking down this way home. I spotted coming up the street a British Army Land Rover, and it stopped roughly here beside me. I turned right away and I ran. I heard 2 shots being fired, and I could actually hear the shots passing me. I just kept running and running. Got to here, and the third house on that side was the only house that had its light on. I knew there was someone in, and the door was open. So we ran across the road right away, ran through the house, and the next thing I got smacked in the back of the head with an SLR.
Liam was subsequently put through the same psychological program as the others.
In the autumn of '71, a report came out in the Sunday Times. It became clear that this was a scientific development of brainwashing techniques. What you see in these techniques is the state devising methods to essentially destroy the personality of an individual by scientific means.
Professor Tim Challis was one of the first to make the connection between the Montreal experiments and the interrogation techniques used in Northern Ireland. In 1974, he presented a BBC documentary with the Irish prisoners, who by then had been nicknamed the Hooded Men.
14 were subjected to a technique which has later come to be euphemistically known as interrogation in depth.
The hood is taken off me, and there standing in front of me is a man in a white coat and a stethoscope, and I get a thorough 30-second medical exam. Say sound my chest and just nods, in which I'm dragged away.
They pulled the hood back real tight. You thought you were going to suffocate, and they just used your face as a punch bag. I was squealing like a pig. What do you hear, the wee Fenian bastard? That's all they were saying, like, you know.
I was dragged out of that room. I had no shoes on at the time. I could feel everything, the different textures of the floor.
I finish up with their insistence, not insistence, that I have my fingertips against the wall, on my toes, in a stressed position.
It seems itself to be completely innocuous. All you're doing is leaning forward against the wall. Why should this be a problem? But it is a problem if you have to retain that position, so it becomes extremely painful when it doesn't appear to be painful from the point of view of the lay observer.
They were asking you questions, do you know there's any A or M, and do you know there's any guns, and you're saying no, and it didn't make any difference. You still got battered every time you said you knew nothing, you didn't know anything.
I was completely confused, lost. I can never remember sleeping.
After considerable experimentation, it was found if individuals were placed with their eyes bandaged, they would not only pass into a confused and extremely anxious state, but they would show some interesting phenomena.
In addition to the mental disturbance produced by the sensory deprivation, the sleep deprivation, you're adding in pain, which is going to increase stress yet again, which will then lead to these strange mental experiences occurring.
I've been told that we were drugged, and it would certainly fit in with how I was feeling at the time. A doctor once said that the drugs were administered through the water that we were given to drink. It was after that that the hallucinations started, the madness started.
And then I start to notice this noise, this high-pitched screaming noise. It appears to come in through my hair, down through my body and out through my toes, and just circles right round, and each time it goes through the body it touches every nerve, sinew in the body. Where it starts to occupy my mind, it takes over my brain.
The veracity of this noise would go up, until it was ear-piercing, and then it would go down again. And if you can imagine that inside the hood, this noise was exaggerated 100-fold.
They thought they were going to kill us. I started saying the rosary on my fingers, and my fingers got that numb that I couldn't follow it, and all it ended up was a litany of Hail Marys. It was 9 days of hell, that's all it was, 9 days of hell.
They were subjected to essentially the same two foundational techniques that had been developed as a result of the CIA's behavioral research in the United States during the 1950s, nearly 20 years before.
The two most important were sleep deprivation and isolation. In Ireland, they got no sleep at all for the first few days.
This combination of procedures, which are each in itself is extremely simple and extremely cheap to produce, comes from the abstraction from scientific work. And the consequence of this in the men that I've interviewed was a long-term traumatic neurosis, post-traumatic stress disorder.
If I'm in a room by myself, there's a terrible sort of faking of me or something, you know. I have to have something, even if it's only a dog in the room, I have to have something with me.
It was carried out with the intention of understanding brainwashing procedures, and it certainly succeeded in doing so.
And I remember there came the acceptance that the end result of this is my death. I actually remember looking forward to it because it stopped the pain, it stopped just stopped this whole thing that had taken over my body and my mind, and I had this welcoming of death coming and bring it sooner rather than later.
My mother and my wife, they just went everywhere. They went everywhere to try and find out where I was. My wife was fortunate enough to get the phone number of Brian Faulkner, the then Prime Minister of, as they call it, Northern Ireland. She rang her and she says, "Your husband had my husband taken away. I would like for you to ask him where he is, because everybody's denying knowing where he is." And she just basically says, "These are terrible times. I'll talk to him when he comes in," and put the phone down.
In 1971, Ireland took the UK to the European courts. They argued that the men had been tortured by the British. The European Court of Human Rights eventually decided that the hooded men had not been tortured, but instead endured inhuman and degrading treatment. The global precedent set by this 1978 judgment allowed governments around the world to legally use these techniques.
On the 30th of July 2011, the first reunion of the Hooded Men in 40 years took place here. I'll just move up. This is a photograph of it. We discussed the possibility of reopening the case, but one vital ingredient was missing from the recipe, and that was to get the Irish government to bring the British government back to the European Court of Human Rights. That was the goal. To me, it was game on.
Hello, my name's Francis McGuigan. I'm now a 70-year-old grandfather, and in 1971, I was one of the Hooded Men. We went through 9 days of torture and hell.
The Hooded Men case is probably one of the most notorious cases in human rights jurisprudence. The dogs in the street know about the Hooded Men. They know what happened to the Hooded Men, and in particular, they know that it was torture. So this case in particular has a huge historical significance. We have documents that make it very clear, expressly clear, that those at the highest level were not only authorising the techniques, but knew exactly what they were authorising, which was that of torture.
When you see a document in which Merlin Rees had communicated with the British Prime Minister regarding to torture, when you see the word on paper at that level, you know that lies had been told. I spoke to all of the men of their experience. All of them seemed to come to the white noise, more so even than the beatings. And the machine that was used to create white noise, it actually cost less than £1 to manufacture.
Through the act of making art is how I process my thoughts and ideas. I was thinking about the family tree, and I was thinking about, in our family, something came in out of left field and broke a branch on our family tree. I think a lot about how that broken branch sorts itself out from generation to generation, from my grandmother to my mother to me. And specifically with this one, thinking about how a parent will try and protect their child from the traumas of their past, and they're trying to bury it deep inside, to keep it inside, to protect the ones they love.
In 1977, the New York Times broke the story of Dr. Ewen Cameron's CIA mind control program. One of the people reading the story was Val Orlico's husband.
A Canadian member of Parliament, David Orlico, read in the New York Times for the first time that Ewen Cameron had been a recipient of CIA funding. David Orlico contacted our office and said, "Isn't there something we can do about this? This is a horrible human rights abuse," and my wife was one of the victims.
My father had contacted many lawyers in both Canada and in the United States, and no one was prepared to do this. They were very, very brave to go up against the government in this way, and I think that my parents thought of them as heroes, and so did I.
This is as strenuous uphill fight as you can undertake, because people can conceal on the other side, and when they're caught, they can say, "Oh, national security, you don't get to find out. We're going to go talk to the judge by ourselves." And they did that.
Between 1981 and 1988, Harvey put his life on hold as he tried to find out what really happened in Montreal.
This court case dragged on and on and on because the CIA simply said they couldn't be accountable for something that happened in Canada.
David Orlico's standing as a member of Parliament didn't really help us that much. The powers that be in Ottawa were more concerned about not rocking the boat with their American colleagues than they were about advancing a case that was brought by one of their own members of Parliament.
There were a lot of bizarre physical therapies going on in psychiatry at the time, but no one had ever used the combination of very powerful drugs, electroconvulsive therapy, extended sleep, sensory isolation, and all the other methods that he was using. There had been never anything like this.
Our investigations and reduction of stimuli have depended upon more rigorous and sustained reduction of sensory input. The nurses had instructions to reduce all communication to a minimum.
They were also trying to claim that Cameron hadn't harmed these people, that these people all had psychiatric impairments of one kind or another.
This is where I grew up. This was my street. You see that tree there? I remember when I could put my fingers around it We planted that tree. So that tree was planted in 1945. It's quite a long time ago.
Harvey decided to write a book about his father's experiences. As he researched the legal case, he began to get a lot of attention.
Some strange things were happening. Mail was arriving at our house opened. There were all these strange clicks on the telephone. And I asked the lawyers in Washington, this is really weird because it sounds like, somebody's tapping their phone or, this is intimidating. Do you think this is realistic? And they said, could be, could not be. They can do all this stuff without you even knowing about it, so could be. And then a couple of very strange events occurred. I had been to dinner with my wife, and all of a sudden, someone is motioning to me to move over. I get out of the car to see flames coming from under the car, and the whole car was totaled. Okay, I could say that's just coincidence. That's really odd, right? Then about 2 weeks after that, I'm driving to pick up my kids from a school dance. Clear night, clear road. From behind me comes a car with no headlights on, slams into me, pushes me off the road and disappears. It's something that I really haven't spoken about, and nothing like this, of course, ever happened again. But it does raise interesting questions.
Sarah has been making art about her grandmother since 2009.
I think of it this as like a purgatory state, or just like a, never got resolved. She never got better. This is how they torture people now. So they tortured my grandmother, whether that was the intent at the time or not. That was the outcome. So she just had to deal with this for the rest of her life. There was no happy ending. It continued for her until she died.
What's remarkable to me is something I never thought at the time. We thought this was over. We thought this was about history of the 1950s and early 1960s. It never crossed my mind that the United States would be using methods that Cameron used to destroy people.
I have to admit, I think I know the world fairly well, at least even if I haven't traveled to it, but I really didn't know about the Twin Towers. I didn't know that the Twin Towers even existed. On 9/11, my friend knocked the door in a state of sort of semi-panic. He said, America's been attacked.
I will never forget that day. I was installing service for a German NGO. One of the workers said, there is a war in the United States of America. And I was saying, what?
Oh, no. Oh, no.
I was in my office, which is in downtown Manhattan. And suddenly the phone started to ring a lot.
Let's go, guys. Let's go. Right here, right here.
We were really sad. So much like senseless loss of life.
At the time, we knew little about Al-Qaeda. We knew little about their operations and how that group was able to evolve to a point that 19 thugs with box cutters was able to bring the United States to our knees. There was a sense that people wanted revenge, as did I. We were attacked, and I wanted to go after those people that attacked us.
Standing thousands of miles away, I never thought that I would be a victim.
Immediately, Mark was ordered to Florida to help draw up the invasion plan of Afghanistan.
Our war on terror begins with Al-Qaeda, but it does not end there. It will not end until every terrorist group of global reach has been found, stopped, and defeated.
It was 2001. I made the decision, life-changing decision it turned out to be, to go to Afghanistan and to do that with my wife and my children, to be involved in helping to set up a school. At the time the Taliban had come into power, the war wasn't raging in the way it had been before. Most of Afghanistan had been pacified.
The war on terrorism begins. America and Britain strike Afghanistan. The first signs of battle, cruise missiles head for targets over Kabul.
On October the 7th, 2001, the war on terror began.
It's panic, it's pure panic. This isn't just the United States bombing sorties and campaigns. This is now soldiers on the ground, armed people in the streets, killing people, arresting people, torturing people, and I'm a target.
Mozzam was captured and detained in Bagram Air Base for a year. In February 2003, he was taken to Guantanamo Bay detention camp, accused of being a member of Al-Qaeda. He was considered high risk, and for the next 22 months, he was held in solitary confinement.
I was born one of 12 kids, and my father used to be a camel herder. 2 weeks after 9/11, when I received a phone call, and it was the DSE, the director of our security in this country. And he explained to me that the US government asked him to arrest me.
Mohamedou was accused of being the leader of an Al-Qaeda cell in both Germany and Montreal. In the chaos, President Bush signed a secret directive giving the CIA authority to kill or capture terrorists anywhere. In the years that followed, several dozen aircraft crisscrossed the globe, making thousands of flights.
People were snatched off the streets of Milan and Stockholm, put into this transnational gulag of Allied sites in Uzbekistan to Morocco.
Faced with an onslaught of prisoners, the Bush administration drew up a memorandum known as the Torture Memos. It set out the legal basis for using these techniques in the war on terror and cited the Hooded Men's 1978 judgment. Within months, the CIA rolled out these methods within Guantanamo and all its black sites. They called them enhanced interrogation techniques.
The CIA turned to contract psychologists who had no experience with Al-Qaeda, who had no experience with interrogations, and had no experience in the Middle East.
Jim and I went into a cubicle, sat down he sat down at the typewriter, and together we wrote out the list as techniques that we thought had worked well in the SEER school,
Well, I had already been told that the Geneva Conventions didn't apply to the captured detainees.
Did not?
Did not apply to the captured detainees by the attorneys at the CIA. And so I don't think I thought about Geneva Conventions.
They understood that we hadn't done interrogations of live terrorists before, but we discussed the other experience and qualifications we had, and so we came to an agreement.
They became what I've often referred to as a modern-day equivalent of snake oil salesmen. These two psychologists were awarded a $183 million contract to run a program of torture.
We must conduct ourselves under the Common Article 3 of the Geneva Convention. And that Common Article 3 says that there will be no outrages upon human dignity. It's very vague. What does that mean?
They used the CIA paradigm of sensory deprivation and self-inflicted pain, and then they stretched it, okay? They added to it. They probed Arab cultural sensitivities, okay? And they discovered that nudity and fear of dogs.
CIA psychologists used Dr. Cameron's experiments on sensory deprivation and overload, along with the Cold War SEER program, to create a horrific mix of torture techniques.
The program included even putting people into coffins to create such inhumane conditions that you would be under the power. They called it demonstrated omnipotence.
Social change has almost entirely taken place in consequence of something else. It has not been controlled. We need to protect society from those that can bring it once more into chaos. The strong must protect others from these people.
Where is my voice?
The American Psychological Association is the world's largest organization of psychologists and probably has the most influence over the community of psychologists around the world.
Secretly, the APA permitted psychologists working in the torture program to override their ethical code of do no harm if the military and CIA required it.
The program of abusive interrogations, the program of torture at the CIA was designed by psychologists, and at Guantanamo was designed by a psychologist and a psychiatrist after they were trained in the techniques and in the program of the CIA abuses. And that's when I could basically stand it no more. And so suddenly I went from just being a psychologist in my office to becoming the face of opposition to the APA's position.
Yesterday, we received our 8th flight of detainees. I can confirm for you that we had 34 detainees arrive.
The goal psychologically was to create the most dreadful conditions you could establish for a human being. And the enhancement to that, if there was an enhancement, was based on a program called Learn Helplessness.
Recently released CIA documents refer to the feasibility of remote control of animals, and that special investigations will be conducted toward the application of selected elements of these techniques to man.
Scientists have long experimented on animals to determine human behavior. In 1967, Dr. Martin Seligman began a series of tests using electric shocks on dogs.
He was able to determine that if you indiscriminately abused a dog, gave them electrical shocks, even if they could avoid those shocks, they would just submit to them. They would learn to be helpless. These dogs would learn helplessness.
Their aim was to undermine the basically mental independence of detainees, the instincts for self-preservation, the ability to think and choose, using techniques modeled on what Seligman did to his dogs.
The psychologists actually designed a program based on those SEER techniques and the theory of learned helplessness, and then tried to apply those theories to human beings.
So the idea was that you could undermine the basic instincts of survival of an animal if you traumatized them or tortured them enough.
We are on soundest ground in demonstrating the effects of reduction of sensory input upon animals. The many analogous situations may be deprivation of human relationships and solitary confinement in jail.
War is a strategic business. Our planning and our execution needs to be really well thought out. And it has consequences for years. I was in conversations with the Department of Defense and with the White House, and I learned that we had psychiatrists and psychologists who were advising the interrogation teams.
Look me straight in the eyes and tell me that you're being honest. I am being honest.
Then I learned that they were not just advising, that they were involved. I was stunned. It's taken all this time for me to build the picture of what's been involved here and the secrecy that was behind this torture program.
In the punishment wing known as India Block, Mahamadou was isolated from all other detainees.
We call it the fridge because it's very cold. I was the worst level, so I mean worst level, no food, nothing, total isolation, psychological and physical torture, and I was being interrogated 24/7. American had a theory because of my activism that I was planted in Germany somewhere to do harm to the United States of America.
A year after Mahamadou's arrest, the alleged coordinator of 9/11 was captured.
They showed me his picture, and I thought to myself, I had seen this guy. Sometimes face is familiar, but you don't know where. So I said, no, I don't know him, I never seen him. But when they asked him, he said, of course I've seen this guy. I met him in this house. Now, they have a very promising lead, like what they call a breakthrough.
In 1999, Mahamadou had met Ramzi Ben Al-Shib when he was an imam in Germany.
They tortured him before they tortured me. And then he told them, yes, yes, yes. And he's the one who helped me go to Afghanistan. They said, either you confess to your crime, or we're going to put you in the torture program. And I said, go for it, very much. I was really stupid, back then.
There was a rumor that began that I'm some kind of an assassin. I told one interrogator that I'd done taekwondo. I had a blue belt when I was a teenager, so I'm an expert in taekwondo.
Part of the media story was that there were these almost ninja warriors, that they had a way of being able to act on you and they had special powers. So they were dangerous, right? This was the worst of the worst.
I speak a couple of languages, so he's an expert in languages. Everything that I did in my life, I have now had become an expert in.
Americans said, the logic says that without you there wouldn't be 9/11.
Suddenly, Mohamedou was classed the most important prisoner in Guantanamo.
This was very heavy.
Meanwhile, a new TV show, 24, became a global hit. 24 expressed and amplified American paranoia. With a masterly control of tension and suspense, it showed how sometimes, to save the world, you just have to torture the bad guys.
It came out right after 9/11. This is homoerotic torture porn, widescreen,
Now!
in incident after incident, uses torture successfully to extract information from enemy terrorists and to actually stop nuclear attacks.
You probably don't think that I could force this towel down your throat. But trust me, I can. All the way.
With tens of millions of people watching them, slowly propagated the idea that if you use torture, you can extract information.
What kind of man are you? I don't want to hurt you. But I will do everything that I have to do to protect my family. I want to show you something.
The role of psychologists in this torture program astounds me. I saw that we're heading down a road that I knew was going to be a disaster. And so I was taking those torture logs and other information, and I was sending them through classified channels. I wasn't a whistleblower. I wouldn't talk to the media, and I wouldn't disclose classified information. I was sending this information through my chain of command to say, the Department of Defense is about to torture people.
In 2002, Mark put his neck on the line and warned his superiors that the CIA were using torture.
I felt like there was an avalanche. You can see these boulders coming down and you can wave your arms and you can try to stop it. But I could not stop what was happening. The bloodthirst to torture people was just too great for any one person to stop.
Your interrogation rules of engagement go far beyond the Geneva Convention. Stress positions, sleep management, dietary manipulation. All of these things go far beyond a standard which says there'll be no physical or mental torture nor any other form of coercion. That's the Geneva Convention. These rules of engagement for interrogation issued by your department are inconsistent with those.
General Myers, correct me if I'm wrong, but my recollection is that any instructions that have been issued or anything that's been authorized by the department was checked by the lawyers in your shop, in the department, in the office of the Secretary of Defense, and deemed to be consistent with the Geneva.
Absolutely. And
US Secretary of Defense Donald Rumsfeld was convinced that Mohamedou recruited 3 of the 9/11 hijackers. He personally authorized a 90-day special project status for Mohamedou, with horrendous consequences.
The order to abuse prisoners was unlawful. But to build up to that unlawful order, they needed justification. And so what they did was they sent a colonel to Guantanamo to look and try to justify what was going on. And he said, Guantanamo Bay is America's battle lab. And the moment I heard that, it evoked memories of Nuremberg. It evoked memories of what the Nazis were doing, experiments.
The first thing they started with was the sleep deprivation regime. And then a masked guy dragged me to this room. It was very dark, except for strobe lights. And then he shackled me to the floor, and then he started playing this music. Let the bodies hit the floor all day long. That did not break me. They brought in women. You know, I cannot explain to you when someone is put you in shackles you into the floor, and a group of people, 2 women and a guy, come and force them onto you. It's really very humiliating, especially someone of my culture.
In the next room, there were sounds of a woman screaming that they made me believe was my wife being tortured. That was the worst. It was the worst because I thought simultaneously many things, that I will sign whatever you want me to do, but at the same time, I even though my hands were shackled, that I want to, with these shackled hands, put them around your neck and twist it until there's no life left in you.
What really broke me, when they said they will arrest my mother and she would be raped. That did it for me. Why? Because you would say this is a movie, this is not real.
For my first almost 2 years in Guantanamo in particular, much of the torture was psychological. And slowly but surely it eats away at you. And you have to tell yourself that you're not a father, you're not a son, you're not a husband. You're just the number that they've given you, because if you start thinking outside of that, you will break yourself down. As things went on, I started to think that there is a clear relationship between the medical staff and the interrogators. The question was, who was instructing whom? Were the interrogators instructing psychologists, or was it the other way around?
Do no harm, which is the psychologist's ethics code, was given up, I think, by different psychologists involved in the CIA and the military for different reasons. For the American Psychological Association, there was what I would consider collusion, and worse, they took a blind eye to the abuses that were being reported.
We know that war has a moral imperative. America after 9/11 was in shock. And I think we had been deeply frightened, and I think that fear was exploited certainly in the years after that, and has continued to be exploited.
My understanding is you've met more 9/11 detainees than any other person.
I've met a number of them, yes. I've met probably more than anyone outside.
Can you tell me about that?
I can't specifically talk about what I've, my meetings with them or what I've learned about these men. I've met Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, Khalid bin Atash, Ramzi bin al-Shib, Ammar al-Baluchi, and Hassawi. These men were subjected to all these tactics, and there is absolutely no evidence, absolutely not a shred of evidence that these tactics used on these men really gave us any intelligence that was important or useful to our country.
We created Al-Qaeda in Iraq with our torture programs. And Al-Qaeda in Iraq morphed into what we call ISIS today. Daesh, ISIL, the same group. It's just a manifestation of torture. These are programs that we created, and we're living with those results today.
You sound like you think this is war crimes.
Oh, this is absolutely war crimes. We knew there were war crimes.
This new substitute motion is here to rectify 10 years of deceitful and secret collusion to impede the will of the membership.
In Toronto, Stephen Reisner and the other protesters' battle with the APA was coming to an end.
We're here today to reset our moral compass.
We had been trying for 10 years to prevent psychologists from being part of national security interrogations.
The motion passes.
That we exposed it, we acknowledged it, we apologized for it, and we changed it.
After being held for 3 years, Mozzam was released without charge.
A person asks himself, well, what would have happened if I just simply got on a plane and gone back home to England? What would have happened? Would I have ended up in Guantanamo? Would this painful period ever have happened? Would I be the person I am today? I can't answer those questions. But I do often say to myself, why didn't I just get on a plane and go back home?
Mahamadou's confessions were found to be the result of torture. He was released without charge after 14 years in Guantanamo.
I was no match to them. They destroyed me. They won. They broke me. And there is nothing I could say, to save my face or to say, oh, I won. No, I did not. Because those people are professional doctors who studied just for this purpose, to destroy human spirit and make it dependent, obedient, and make them confess to whatever they wanted them to confess to.
In August 2017, the 2 psychologists who created the CIA's torture program were about to be put on trial.
We were soldiers doing what we were instructed to do. We knew it was lawful. We knew it was legal. We knew it had been vetted and approved.
Do you think it's possible, as a psychologist, that an individual who was subjected to them suffered long-term physical or psychological harm?
Objection. Do you think it's possible that sleep deprivation taken to the extreme could induce severe mental pain or suffering?
Objection.
The CIA settled out of court for an undisclosed amount. No liability was admitted. In Northern Ireland, it's Judgment Day. After a second appeal, the European Court will decide if the hooded men were tortured.
When I used to box and that, I used to get very nervous before a fight. But then when the bell went, the nerves stopped. I think this is about something similar. I've been looking forward to this day for many, many, many years. Already 6.5 years since the actual event.
Felt tense yesterday afternoon, last night, but this morning I'm grand. Thank God.
I had 3 heart attacks 2 years ago in the space of 5 days. I have 9 stents in my heart. This year, in April of this year, I had an aneurysm worked on and a graft put in. I know I'm running out of time.
No one questions their mortality until someone close to them passes. There's 10 of these men still alive and 4 are dead. They deserve the justice in their lifetime. And does that sit heavily on my shoulders? Yep. Do I feel the responsibility of it? Yes.
He used to drink to try and, forget about the nightmares, but they still kept coming at the same time, When Nelson Mandela got out of Robben Island, he had forgive his torturers and forgive the people that imprisoned him. And I thought, well, I wonder if I forgive them, would it help? And it did help. But you just don't forget it, you can never forget it.
Good morning, sir. You look tired.
That's nerves. Let's see.
No, I'm actually quite confident.
And I heard yesterday it was Jerry McCure's anniversary, and today is the 15th anniversary of the Iraq War. So I was thinking there's a divine intervention.
Oh, that's right, sir. It's,
They were ahead, you see. You're sorry.
They're an hour ahead of us.
At 10 o'clock, European Court are going to give the result. I just cannot accept that the European Court is going to find a result other than the fact that we were tortured. I believe now that the European Court is beyond political decisions today. I believe that they believe human rights are much more important.
Record the moment if there.
You imagine the repercussions throughout the world if Britain, Great Britain as she calls herself, is convicted of torturing which she classified as her own citizens.
Don't think it looks good. But did not constitute practice of torture. Dismisses it by 6 votes to 1.
So we lost it?
We lost.
No. 6 to 1. They just, the ruling seems to be based on the fact that the court understood all the issues that we brought up. The court understood them at the time.
Liam, we lost it 6 votes to 1.
Bad news. We lost it 6 to 1.
Despite damning new evidence uncovered in the UK's National Archives, the European Court of Human Rights decided not to overturn the original 1978 judgment.
This is a bad day for justice. The European Court of Human Rights were given an opportunity today to correct a lot of things and didn't do it.
I think that certain governments think that degrading and inhumane treatment is grand, it's torture.
This landmark ruling means the same psychological techniques are still not classified as torture.
There's no skin from there to there and there. The insteps of my feet, the skin is gone off, I've been dragged along corridors. I have 3 fractured ribs. My wrist is grand now. Shows that one. Shows my insteps of my feet. Shows my ribs. It's up here.
The European Court of Human Rights has rejected an Irish government request to overturn a ruling that said 14 men detained during internment in Northern Ireland did not suffer torture. The so-called hooded men.
Ireland is now appealing the European Court of Human Rights judgment.
World law and government will intensify the problem of the growing anonymity of the common man. What we must do is to see our world spread, neither friendly nor unfriendly around us. A world in which we must at last take final responsibility for ourselves.
I am asking Congress to ensure that in the fight against ISIS and Al-Qaeda, we continue to have all necessary power to detain terrorists wherever we chase them down, wherever we find them. And in many cases, for them, it will now be Guantanamo Bay.
In America, a $500 million construction program has been announced at Guantanamo Bay, which could see it treble in population.
There is a very big battle going on now. There is a group of operational psychologists who are working to undo the progress that we were made, turn back the clock, return psychologists to Guantanamo Bay, put psychologists back in the interrogation business, and we're trying to hold the line.
This is the gut punch for America, Canada, for Britain, for the Allies. The rule of law is founded in human rights. The victim of torture has shattered that.
What makes this issue important? Guantanamo has become the calling cry. Torture is some sign of American power that allows people to think that America will be great again. The United States right now is one terrorist attack away from reinstituting torture.
Since the 1950s, we know these techniques have been used in Afghanistan, Argentina, Australia, Borneo, Brazil, British Guyana, British Cameroon, Canada, Chile, Cuba, Great Britain, Guatemala, Honduras, Iran, Iraq, Israel, Lithuania, Morocco, Northern Ireland, Pakistan, the Philippines, Poland, Romania, Thailand, Turkey, Uruguay, Vietnam, and Yemen.
Of James Elmer Mitchell in the matter of Salim versus James Elmer Mitchell and Bruce Jessen in the United States District Court for the Eastern District of Washington.
Did you have any study in general about how to talk to people or ask questions to people from different cultures?
I don't remember that specifically being covered.
Okay.
They asked me to apply a skill set that I had to a situation. The attorneys at the time said that gloves are off and we need to walk right up to the line of what's legal. Some of the contracts that I had, you could easily make $3,000 a day. This is not a lot of money to a guy like me. I mean, I don't know that it was a matter of patriotism, but that's what I charged.
Were you the architect of this?
I don't really think I was the architect of anything.
Your manuscript says, by James E. Mitchell, PhD, architect of the CIA interrogation program. It says that, right?
Yes.